A battle rages between British and German forces during World War I. The British soldiers are pinned down in their trenches. Bullets fly overhead, grenades explode all around. The Germans are confident that victory is within their grasp, but then a rumbling can be heard across the battlefield. It sounds like a mechanical monster grinding up everything in its path. The Germans begin to cower in their trenches. Could this be the new British war machine that they'd heard about? The rumbling gets louder. The Germans peer over the trenches to watch the vehicle of their demise come over the hill. What they see makes them stare wide-eyed. Their jaws drop. Then the entire German army bursts into laughter as they point at Little Willie, the useless tank. Little Willie was the first tank as we think of them today. However, there were vehicles that came before it and contributed to the tank design. For example, in 1899, Frederick Sims designed the War Car, which had a bulletproof casing and revolving machine guns. It was basically a heavily armored truck. But you can see how something like the War Car eventually developed into tanks. It was in 1914 that Ernest Swinton, a British Army colonel, and William Hankey, Secretary of the Committee for Imperial Defense, came up with the idea of a heavily armored vehicle with conveyor belt-like tracks over its wheels. Their thought process was that the tracks would be useful for driving over rough terrain and breaking through enemy lines. They presented their plans to Winston Churchill, who quickly got on board with the land boat idea. He then organized the Land Ships Committee to begin developing the prototype of what would become Little Willie. In order to keep this new project secret from British enemies, workers were told the vehicle they were building would carry water on the battlefield. It was not too far-fetched, as the new prototype did resemble a water tank. It's for this reason that we call these vehicles tanks today. The very first tank, that later would be called Little Willie, rolled off the assembly line on September 6, 1915. It was designed by an agricultural firm called William Foster & Co. of Lincoln and was built in England. The first name given to the tank was No. 1 Lincoln Machine. It weighed 14 tons and was designed to aid the Allies in trench warfare. The name of the tank was changed to Little Willie based on an insult to German leadership. Little Willie was the nickname that the British gave to the German Crown Prince Kaiser Wilhelm. The mocking of the Crown Prince ended up as an affectionate name for the first tank. The design for Little Willie consisted of a large body, shaped similar to a water tank. It had 10mm thick armor and could hold a crew of 5 soldiers. Little Willie was powered by a Daimler 6-cylinder engine that put out 105 horsepower. Considering the bulkiness and weight of Little Willie, the engine gave the tank a top speed of about 3 miles per hour on a good day. Most of the time, Little Willie traveled around 2 miles an hour. It was not the speediest tank ever built. In order to keep Little Willie from tipping over, a wheeled counterbalance was attached to the tail of the tank. This also helped Little Willie steer, but not very well. The ride inside Little Willie was anything but comfortable. It had no suspension whatsoever. It was like riding around in a giant tin can on tracks. Needless to say, Little Willie was not going to be the best vehicle to use when it came time for combat. The weaponry on Little Willie worked fine. The tank's main armament was a Vickers 2-pounder gun. It was also equipped with various secondary armaments such as Maxim, Hotchkiss, Lewis, and Madsen machine guns. These guns would all later be removed from Little Willie and dispersed to its big brother, Big Willie, or soldiers that were able to do Little Willie's job better than the tank itself. So how useless was Little Willie actually? You probably are thinking it couldn't be that bad, but it was. Oh, it was. Little Willie was designed to cross the trenches during World War I. This was its main job. Under the assumption that Little Willie would be able to do what it was designed for, the British Army ordered 100 of the tanks to be used in the war. Unfortunately, during testing, Little Willie kept getting stuck in the trenches and couldn't get out. The one job Little Willie was created for, it could not do. The order of 100 tanks was quickly canceled. When traveling across the battlefield, Little Willie could barely reach 2 miles per hour. This is about 1 mile per hour slower than the average human walks. Not runs, but walks. Little Willie was slower than a grandpa taking a stroll in the park. Not ideal in a wartime situation. Imagine you're in the midst of trench warfare during World War I. Bullets are flying over your head, screams and whistles fill the air. You need support badly. You look to your left. The men in your platoon are hunched down, afraid that if they peek above the trench, they'll be sniped. The men to your right are tending to wounded soldiers. You begin to panic as you realize this may not only be the trench you've lived in for the past few weeks, but the trench you might be buried in as well. Then the ground starts to shake. You hear the rumbling of a motor and the squeaking of tracks on wheels. You carefully peer over the trench and see a large metal contraption coming toward you. It's Little Willie. You cheer and signal for the driver to come over and provide cover for your men. Little Willie lumbers over at 2 miles an hour. You have to wait over 10 minutes just for it to get to you. Then when Little Willie does arrive, one of its tracks gets stuck in the trench and it spins and spins, but Little Willie is stuck and it can't get out. Now Little Willie needs rescuing. You just shake your head at the useless tank. This is what happened in training exercises during the Little Willie testing phase. The constant breakdowns and getting stuck in trenches was why Little Willie was never deployed to the battlefield. It was probably for the best that Little Willie didn't see battle. It probably would have caused more harm than good. Another problem with Little Willie was that the engine had to work extremely hard just to get the tank moving at a speed of 2 miles per hour. The strain on the engine caused it to overheat. An overheating engine inside a large enclosed metal vehicle is like turning on the burners of an oven full blast while you're inside it. The crew in the tank would literally begin to cook and would have to open hatches or abandon the tank. This overheating problem was another reason Little Willie never made it to the battlefield. Probably the biggest problem Little Willie faced was that it was redundant. Using what they learned from Little Willie, the Brits built a bigger, better version called Big Willie before its predecessor was even tested. Little Willie was never destined to be more than a first step, but in the hearts of military historians, Little Willie means so much more. When you think of it, was there any actual benefit to having built Little Willie? Well, you might be surprised. Little Willie did provide some benefits, which may have not made it completely useless. Or maybe the cons outweigh the pros. We'll let you decide. The first benefit that Little Willie provided was the lessons learned from its construction. Little Willie was not easy to build, and the engineers ran into several difficulties, including how to keep the tracks from falling off and how to keep Little Willie from tipping over. The tracks themselves started by only going partway up the body of the tank. This seemed like a good idea at the time, and it saves on material, and it made the tank a little lighter. But the tracks would damage easily or come off when driving over rough terrain. So the engineers went back to the drawing board and came up with a new idea. They redesigned the tracks to encircle the entire body of the tank from top to bottom. This made the tracks more durable and helped keep them on their wheel bearings. It was due to the trial and error of Little Willie that tanks today have tracks that go around the entire body of the base of the tank. Therefore, one could argue that without Little Willie flaws, tanks today would have taken longer to develop or would be less efficient. Thanks, Little Willie. Another aspect of Little Willie that was useful was the potential that political and military leaders saw in it. Sure, Little Willie was not able to drive over trenches without getting stuck, or it would break down in the middle of a testing field because of overheating, but it was the first tank ever built. The potential was there, and Little Willie had to be built to show the world it was possible. Once Big Willie and subsequent other tank designs were built using the foundation that Little Willie set, the British Army found another use for the tank. Little Willie was used for driver training. The thought might have been that if you could drive Little Willie, you could drive anything. Countless men were able to do their jobs and conquer the enemy because they received their training driving Little Willie. That is something to be proud of. Maybe Little Willie's biggest contribution to the world of warfare is that nostalgia that went along with it. Curators at the Tank Museum in England are proud to display the first tank ever made. At the time Little Willie rolled off the assembly line, the automobile had been around for just 35 years. That's a long way to go from a basic horseless carriage to a tank that could be outfitted with guns and a crew of 5 men in such a short time. Without Little Willie and its struggles, we may not have tanks today. It was through the process of engineering and modern science of the time that Little Willie was made a reality. The British basically took the idea of an armored boat and brought it on land. It had never been done before Little Willie. Sure, the tank itself was pretty useless and never saw combat, but without Little Willie, so many ideas that led to modern useful tanks may never have been thought of. So yes, Little Willie may have been the most useless tank ever made, but in our hearts, it was a true hero. Now go see what Little Willie evolved into by watching the top 10 most powerful tanks. Or for tank battles, watch the Battle of 73 Easting, most intense tank battle in history.